Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome back to another edition of After Hours. We're back to our regular video After Hours this week after a number of weeks of doing the audio After Hours on Mark chapter 13. I hope you found those helpful. But today I wanted to return to an After Hours that deals with the topic that we just covered on Sunday. In this case, we looked at justification on Sunday and talked about that important biblical doctrine. We were using our catechism question to look at it. But today I wanted to expand on a little bit of a side topic, but an important one that's related to this, and that's the question of what is imputed righteousness. If you study some of the controversies that happened at the time of the Reformation, one of them was over the issue of imputed righteousness versus imparted righteousness. And then later on, the Methodist Church started speaking about infused righteousness. But in the Reformation of the 1500s, it was largely over imputed versus imparted righteousness. Imparted means that grace is actually put inside you and you begin to kind of work along with it. And this has become the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church across time. But imputed righteousness is a righteousness that is credited, a righteousness that comes from another. It is what was often referred to as an alien righteousness. Now, some of the places that this comes from in the New Testament, one of the important ones that you can see it is in Romans chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. Paul is really dealing with justification in Romans 3 and 4. And here in this passage, he says, what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the man who does not work, but trusts the God who justifies the wicked, his faith is credited as righteousness. So notice here, Paul uses this word credited 3 times, and that is what lies behind the idea of imputed righteousness. The word credited was often used. The Greek term behind it was a term that was used in accounting, and it meant to credit something to someone else's account, to put a deposit in their account or to remove a debt from them. And so notice that God credits righteousness. The righteousness is not there. He's not finding it. He's not improving upon it. He is crediting it from outside. And Paul thinks this is so important. He mentions it 3 times in these 3 verses. In every single verse, he mentions that the righteousness of justification is a righteousness that is credited. That's where the idea of imputation comes from. And notice that to further bring this out, Paul says it's not by them having any merit or works. In verse 4, he says, when a man works, the wages aren't credited, they're earned. It's an obligation. They deserve what they're getting. But he says that's not what's going on in justification. Paul says, in fact, that it is given to the one who does not work in verse 5. So far from being based on my own works in any way, or God gives something and then I kind of work on it and improve it. No, it is alien righteousness that is given, that is placed upon me. And it is given as a gift, not in any way as an obligation, and it's given to one who does not work. In fact, Paul says that God, in doing this, is justifying the wicked. So notice that the righteousness is not given there, and God says suddenly, well, oh, you are righteous now because I've put something in you. No, God actually is justifying a person who is in actual fact wicked, but God is crediting righteousness to them. He is placing upon them a righteousness. He's imputing it to them. He's crediting it to them from the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And notice that Paul says this is done in Romans 4, 3 to 5, to the one who believes. Abraham believed God, and therefore it was credited as righteousness. In verse 5, the one who does not work but trusts God, same word there, who believes in God. He's trusting God who justifies the wicked. That's the one who has it credited to them. Now, sometimes these things can seem like just arguing over little terms, and is this really important? But it actually is really critical for 3 reasons that we understand The righteousness that justifies us is not our own, but rather that which comes from Christ. It is an imputed righteousness. The first reason is to believe in imputed righteousness for justification, or to believe in an imparted righteousness, If you deny that it's imputed, but rather you believe it's an imparted righteousness for justification, you're actually denying the gospel itself. You're sneaking in our works. You're somehow making it back about us, this was the problem that the Pharisees had. It was the problem in the medieval Catholic Church. It's the problem that many even Protestants have today, that we want to rely on our own works. Imputed righteousness protects us from that wicked, ungodly, gospel-denying tendency. Secondly, it underscores, when we understand that it's imputed righteousness, not imparted, it underscores that our hope is not in our righteousness. It's not my righteousness and what I've done, but rather the righteousness that comes from God. That's Paul's term in Romans chapter 3, verse 21. And in that section, he mentions that a couple times. It's a righteousness that comes from God. In Philippians 3:9, where Paul says, whatever was to my credit, any merit I possibly might have thought I had, I counted as dung. And Paul uses a very strong word there. It's all dung, because I'm not looking for a righteousness of my own, but rather I'm looking for the righteousness of Christ, the righteousness that comes from God and is by faith. If we're going to be justified, it's going to be an alien righteousness that is going to justify us. And then thirdly, in a very practical sense, it is a secure foundation that protects us from fear and a guilty conscience. And this is so important, because to whatever extent we're relying on our own works and what we're contributing in this, we are going to run into the problem of fear and a guilty conscience, because we are going to sin. We are going to fall short. And that leads to all kinds of terrible behavior. I recently read a book called Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is written by James Baldwin. It's a good book, but a challenging book in many ways. And one of the problems is many of the characters in the book, all of who proclaim themselves to be Christians, many of them are preachers, and they're doing this, but they are struggling with a guilty conscience because they have failed, and they failed in significant ways. But because they're not really constantly focusing on the righteousness that is alien, that is given to them, it leads them to be harsh, legalistic, really rejecting of other people. It leads to being Pharisaical. This is exactly one of the problems that was going on with the Pharisees. The Pharisees, remember in the parable that Jesus tells about the man in the temple, and I think it's Luke 18, where the Pharisee recounts what he's done. He's counting in his righteousness, whereas the tax collector is the one who falls down, will not even look to heaven, and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. All I'm bringing is my sin. And Jesus says, this is the one who was justified. The very one that Paul says God is justifying the wicked, the one who is trusting that it will be an alien righteousness. And so this is very, very practical, because when we start to slip from that, it leads to a guilty conscience, it leads to fear, and that almost always, that fear and guilt and shame leads to Pharisaical, harsh treatment of other people. And there is nothing that can be more harsh, hypocritical, somebody that you unpleasant to be around than a religious person who has a guilty conscience and has shame because they are aware they have not met the standard on their own. We never can meet the standard on our own. That's why we need an alien righteousness. And so this idea of imputed righteousness is not just an argument over a few words here or there hundreds of years ago. It has very practical implications for us today. Brothers and sisters, I encourage you to meditate deeply on justification. And really what we're talking about is this double imputation, that my sin was placed on Christ and he took it away, and his righteousness is placed on me. That is a solid foundation, not only for the day of judgment, but it's a solid foundation for me living my life now. It even provides a solid basis for my sanctification, where I do actually grow in righteous conduct. But it's because that I know I am fully accepted before God because of the work of Christ. I hope this is helpful, and I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to us gathering again soon for worship. I always remind us that when we're doing this, please plan to come early, bring a friend, and then hang out afterwards. Especially, I want to start reminding us on November the 24th, we're going to have a great time of fellowship early in the morning. So please plan on coming early, starting, I think it is at 8:30 that morning, to have just a special breakfast being made by the coffee ministry, spend time in fellowship, and then worship with your brothers and sisters. Have a great week. God bless.